Hello and welcome to that Bible Guy, to the continuation of our series on the book of Romans. Today we come to Romans 13. We may be familiar with this passage. Should I always submit to the authorities? That's our question for today. Should I always submit to the authorities? I threw in the word always because should we submit to the authorities? Well, it's going to be an obvious yes. But should we always submit? Well, yes, but maybe not. Okay, so we're going to look at Romans 13, and we're going to read the first couple of verses here. And it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong." So interesting passages and much talked about scriptures over many years. So Paul talks about the governing authorities. So he's talking about the state and official representatives. The word is exousia. Exousia is the word for authorities here. Now, around this time, and over the years, there's been discussion on these scriptures. And there's been sort of four models that were talked about. There's little elements of technical elements to this today. But four models that were talked about as to what could Paul mean between the exousia, the authorities, the church and the authorities. What kind of relationship is Paul talking about? Well, there was four models that were being talked about at one time or another, and we'll just get an idea of what they were. The first one is Erastianism, which basically means the state controls the church. State is responsible for the church. The second one is theocracy. The church controls the state. The third one is Constantinianism, which was a compromise. The state favors the church, and then the church sort of accommodates the state, sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, that type of scenario. And then the last one, the fourth one, was just described as partnership. So the church and the state recognize and encourage each other. There's what did you say? Constructive collaboration between the two. There's constructive collaboration, but there are differences. And it was more this last one that most scholars believe Paul had in mind. And certainly that's what I think when I read this. It's definitely not theocracy even. We're not controlling the state and vice versa. It's more of a partnership. So most likely that's what's in Paul's mind. And we think, well, Jesus kind of said the same things. He said in Mark 12, verse 17, when asked about paying taxes to Caesar, he said, look, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And he didn't shy away from that, but give to God what is God's. And it definitely has that idea of partnership. Try to do both. Work with both as best you can. It's not one against the other necessarily. We'll come there in a moment. But at this particular time, what Paul was writing here to the church in Rome, there were no Christian authorities. There was no global, no regional, no local Christian authorities at all. And the authorities at this time were the Romans and the Jews. The Roman and the Jewish authorities were the ones that were in charge at this point. Now, what do we know about them? Well, we know that they were very hostile to the church, largely hostile to the church. And yet this is what Paul was saying. He was saying that the authorities that exist have been established by God. And you think, wow, he's saying the authorities have been established by God. Now, this was a firm belief that I believe came from the Old Testament. If you flick for a second, I may put the scripture up, Daniel chapter 4. His fundamental belief was that the authorities that exist have been established by God. Well, where did this idea come from? Well, Daniel chapter 4 throws out this Old Testament idea, and it fits exactly with that. Daniel chapter 4 verse 17, it says, "The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people." Belshazzar gets his dream interpreted, and Daniel says this on two more occasions. He says this in verse 25 and verse 32, that God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth. Need to open this again. So in Paul's mind then, as I flick back here, the state was a divine institution with divine authority. And that's what God has said in the Old Testament, and that's what Paul believes now in the New. The authorities that exist have been established by God. All human authority is derived originally, it came about from God. And you think of what Jesus said to Pilate, this makes sense. He says, you have no authority except what is given to you by God. So his authority that Jesus recognized to an extent was, you have no other authority other than what God has given you. So Jesus recognized this principle as well. The authority you have as in a man-made, the government that you're in, the church, the state, that you are representing, the official representative of that authority, that came from God. And Jesus recognized that too. And I think what Paul's then stating in Romans 13 here is like a divine ideal, more than the human reality, because we know that man is flawed and they do not end up executing the laws the way God would want them executed. But it was more of a divine ideal than a human reality in this one. Again, like, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. In other words, they should always do the right thing. And they should only hold terror for those who do wrong. And they should always be seeking to lift people up, do what is morally right. But we know that that's not always the case. So it's a divine ideal rather than a human reality. We also know, so for me, when I think about that for a moment, I think, yes, authorities established by God. That causes some of us a bit of a challenge. I've been on the receiving end of mistreatment in my early days because of authorities and sectarianism that existed. So that initially gets me thinking, that's not black and white. Now, at the same time, I have to say, the authorities have sometimes revealed to me where I wasn't doing the right thing. I remember one particular time I was given a DVD, I've shared this before, a music CD, that I really wanted to listen to, but I learned as I looked at the CD that had been given to me that it had been copied. And at that point, I then, after listening to it once, and I took it out and thought, I then looked into copyright law and realized copyright law tells me I shouldn't listen to this. It's doing the artist out of money and looking after their own finances. Whether they're a millionaire or not is besides the point. So I thought, I'm actually not doing good for my neighbor here, and I need to not listen to this because it's copyrighted, and there is copyright laws. Another time was I must confess, I was speeding in my car. You're in a rush somewhere, you need to get somewhere, you're running late. It's like you're justified 37 when you really should be doing 35, 32 when you should be doing 30, 35 when you should be doing 30. I was pulled up, you got brought to a center where you do a speed awareness course. And we all feel rather guilty that weekend, and we're all looking around at each other going, we've all done wrong. And when we hear it, we know we've done wrong. We justified it earlier on, but then when we're up before the authorities, if you like, we're like, okay, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. And then you change your ways. So we do need checked, and the authorities on the whole should be there to help us do good, even when we don't realize we should do good or we're not doing the good we should do. However, this is not all black and white. We should absolutely seek to obey the authorities. Always, not necessarily. We all know Acts 5:29, where Peter had said, look, we must obey God rather than man. So whether your authoritative instruction or laws interfere with God's laws, then that's where it changes. We obey until it conflicts with God's commands. Now, what I would say there is we need to be clear about what God's commands are before we say, I won't obey that law. So we need to probably have a bit of a consensus around whatever group we're involved in, that's clearly God's commands and we must follow God's commands. There are obviously grey areas in there where we feel like, should I not? I mean, for instance, I'm just letting you know my own thoughts for a moment. One of the things I think was a good idea at the time that I feel personally opposed to right now, for a lot of very sincere and genuine reasons, would be the introduction of another full lockdown. I know that coronavirus has certainly been going and the cases have been growing, but personally speaking, I feel like I need to do something if there's another stringent lockdown introduced. I've spoken to many people with significant mental health problems, suicidal people as well. And in my job, I see this every day, and I feel like some of the stats that are given regarding, I'm not going to go on a rant here, by the way, just stats that are given regarding one thing are not looked at as accurately sometimes, and then the stats regarding the impact of a lockdown are not always seen either, and the pain and destruction from that is again, you're weighing one against the other. But I've feelings about that. What could I do if that is implemented? Would it be right for me to stand against that? These kind of thoughts. Again, I'm not something I talk about very often, but just to give you an idea of grey areas. Now, I want to help us for a moment. So I am saying we should obey the authorities. We should seek to always obey the authorities. If it conflicts with God's commands, that's different. We probably need to be clear about what that command is. If we want to then say, I won't follow this authoritative command from the authorities, the exousia. But just one thing for a moment to help us. That idea I talked about a moment, about a perspective on God, is the one who, as it says, established the authorities. Here's just an interesting word. It says in verse 4, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. The one in authority, them authorities that we see, is a servant of God. It describes them as servant of God. And this is quite interesting. The word for servant here is diakonos. Diakonos. And that's the same word used for ministers of the church. So it's a good perspective to have when you think about authorities. These authorities, like Jesus recognized of Pilate, the authority has came from God. These people, the police, the fire services, the ambulance services, all these people with some level of authority, the courts, the judicial system, they've all been put there as ministers of God. They may not realize that, they may not see themselves like that, but in a way, they've been described here in the same way as evangelists, as church people, as ministers. Now, there are differences clearly, but what Romans 13 is telling us is that these authorities have been established by God. They don't always follow God's path, but it just gives us, for me, this is personally very helpful. Because I realize God's in control. Now, he doesn't control every little nuance of life. He gives people free will. But you know what? God is in control. And he's always been in control. And he decides what happens and what doesn't happen from a big picture perspective. He doesn't make people do things. People have the opportunity to be evil and resist him. But it gives me confidence to know, like Jesus said to Pilate, God has given you this authority. You're not exercising it right, but God has power over all kingdoms. As it said to Daniel in verse 4, is God, as it said, just to read that again, God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of people. God is in charge. God is in control. We should obey the authorities and seek to always obey the authorities, unless it conflicts with God's commands and God's will. We can see the big perspective that Paul had, that Daniel talks about, which is super helpful to help us to realize God has things covered. So if that helped us today, just let me know your thoughts on that. Please drop your comments here. Please like the video. Please share it on for other people to see this. Please subscribe to That Bible Guy. And thanks so much for all your support. I'll be back with you all again very soon. And let's get this word out there.